Where we left off, I was talking a little bit about the difference between a indirect democracy and a direct democracy. Okay, in a direct democracy, excuse me, pardon me, I've been talking a lot. In a direct democracy, individual citizens are going to be voting on every single issue. You can't get anything done that way. So in a country, we need to choose who our leaders are going to be so that they will vote on our behalf. That is what a representative democracy is. And again, you'll notice there's a section here on the election process. I'm not going to go into a detailed analysis of the election process because you have that previously posted. There's a flow chart. There are a couple of recorded videos. We also did a formative multiple choice quiz, looking at the overall process and the cost and who's involved and key vocabulary. So I'm not going to spend the time to go into that right now. But we know that our Constitution, which is the foundation for how we do things as a country, says that we need to ensure that we have regular elections in order to make sure that our politicians remain accountable. And I think I made mention of this in the previous class as well, where the whole idea of accountability is if I'm a politician and I know once I get elected that I'm never going to lose my job, well, I just might say whatever I need to in order to get elected. And then once I'm there, I don't care anymore because I have my job for life. Elections keep politicians accountable because they know they are going to have to get re-elected. So we also spent some time, and again, when we look at dealing with levels of government and branches of government, when we talked about laws being made, we did focus on a lot of federal politics. Federal politics, of course, affect the entire country. Because when it talks about cabinet meetings, we actually did a cabinet meeting role-playing activity where everyone was part of the same team. And we know that cabinet ministers not only are elected members of parliament, but they have been hand-selected by the prime minister to have an additional responsibility as part of the executive branch. And actually, this might be, I'll probably ask some sort of question, and I'm not trying to be super political here, but I might ask you a question like, hey, how come Justin Trudeau is the prime minister? I didn't vote for him. To get you to unpack sort of an understanding of how someone actually becomes prime minister. We know that Canadians do not vote directly for the prime minister. They will, choose an MP, or well, actually a candidate in an election that represents a political party that they would say, this is the one that I want to support. And whichever party wins the most electoral ridings, right? We know that there's 338 in total. Whichever party wins the most seats will form the government. And so we actually had an election not that long ago, as you'll recall. And Justin Trudeau's Liberal government is still in power, but they are what you call a minority government, meaning they do not have over half of the seats in the House of Commons. And again, if you're hearing these terms again, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, majority, minority government. Oh yeah, what about, that reminds me of that whole vote of non-confidence thing. I will say respectfully, I have detailed posted videos a little bit early in the semester that walk you through in painstaking detail how that works. And so I will gently remind you of those resources and suggest that if you're a little bit fuzzy on some of the specifics there about the interworkings of, Parliament and the election process, etc., it is worth your time, especially prior to the culminating activity, to go back and revisit that. I'll just say it. I know that the culminating activity cannot negatively impact your grade. So on the one hand, you might feel like, why would I study? It doesn't matter. Personally, I think that's the wrong attitude to have. I would say that you probably want to end on a good note. So if anything, why not use this opportunity to give your best effort, to show that, hey, you know what, I may have had some challenges throughout the semester with certain topics, but I've gone over it again. I've grown a lot, and now I want to end on a positive note. You giving your best effort is really the most desirable outcome. And I also just want to point this out again, not that it will count against you numerically, but I haven't done your report card comments yet. So when I am formulating those, when I'm looking over your culminating activity, if it very much appears as though you just kind of whipped through it and didn't care, then, I mean, my report comment is going to have to, I can only go based on evidence. So if it is apparent that you kind of just, left things blank, or just sort of, giving me one word answers, really aren't thinking your way through, then, I mean, yeah, it might not hurt you numerically, but I think it's the wrong approach to take. At the risk of, I don't want to use our remaining time to stress that. I think I've made my point. I think you've heard it from other teachers as well. When we talk about Canada's political parties, I want to make this very clear. I have never told you who to vote for. I've told you the process of how Canadians choose their elected representatives. So I have told you how to vote in a technical sense. I've told you about voter criteria and eligibility. We've also talked about the history of the vote in Canada and how it was not a system that was open and transparent at the turn of the century. In fact, and we said this before, there was great voter discrimination early on in Canada's history. And so now the only eligibility criteria is for you to be a Canadian citizen and also to be at least 18 years of age. And as long as you fulfill those two criteria, you are eligible to vote in your nation's elections. Political parties are ways in which Canadians will sort of, I don't want to say join clubs, but we like to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And often, if you're looking at your own friend groups or anything like that, this isn't always the case, but often you will, have a group of friends based somewhat on shared interests. Over time, yeah, and actually sometimes you might find that this can happen. Not that I want to bring up sad memories for you, but you may have had, actually there's a great line in an old classic Simpsons episode where it talks about Milhouse and Bart being friends. I realize no one has watched The Simpsons in like 20 years. But back when it was funny, it was a throwaway line, but it was brilliant. It was talking about Bart and Milhouse being friends. And, they said, well, why are you guys friends? And Bart says, geographic convenience, which made me laugh as a geography teacher. But there's some truth to that, right? If you look at when you're a kid, who are your friends? Your friends are basically whoever is close to you, like who lives on the street or who's in your class at school, right? The people who are just around, those often form your early friend groups. As you get older, sometimes you will have friends that will be, lifelong friends for good or for bad, for, richer, for poorer. They've always been there, pinky promise or whatnot. But with a lot of, sort of your elementary school friends, you may have found that you don't keep in touch with a great number of them because over time, it isn't that you ever had a fight or you ever said like, oh, you can't come to my birthday party anymore. That was always, oh man, that was always big, right? When people would throw that out in elementary school, that was a major threat. But it wasn't even ever that you had a falling out. Often you grew and they grew and you just kind of grew apart. And nobody really did anything wrong, but you just found that you had different interests, different outlooks. And eventually you realize you didn't really have all that much in common. So you just sort of started spending time with other people. And again, I might actually be like, some of you might turn off your webcams and be like wiping a tear from your eye right now and being like, how did you know? And I'm not trying to, bring up bad memories or anything. I'm just saying that people are unique. People are different. We do have shared similarities. We also have, when we talk about, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, inalienable rights, regardless of gender or race or ethnicity or any of that. But humans are, complex, unique creatures. And it's interesting that even if you look at, fraternal or identical twins, often there will be, if you look at, their interests, or you look at siblings, same household, but they don't always like the same thing. They don't always like the same foods. They don't always see things the same way. People have different outlooks on how the world should be. That's actually connected to the term ideology. And so when we look at political parties and the way that people see the world, often we will cluster with different groups of people. And guess what? That can also change over time. It's very, very common because it depends on the stage of life that you are in. And I mean, just to talk about kind of stereotypes, for lack of a better word, if you go to, university, you will probably see a huge stronghold for the NDP, for the New Democratic Party, an overwhelming support. And you might be like, wow, does everybody support the NDP? But you will find that this support for the NDP, which, by the way, is, if you look at the numbers right now, they're not even the third largest party in the House of Commons. They're a fairly distant fourth right now, even behind the Bloc. You might say, how is this possible if everybody in university, and it's not everybody, but well, again, this is looking at, the overall population and the amount of people that vote. And you will find that although there is a great support for a lot of the policies and viewpoints of the NDP, within, college and university campuses, if you go to the rest of the country and other age groups, you'll find that a lot of that support can often diminish. I've actually seen some memes that have, made me laugh about that, because it kind of goes back to, the idea of, quite frankly, if we look at the idea of taxation, when you don't, and I'm just speaking freely here for the sake of this, video. We've seen other videos. When you don't make any money, you're in school, you maybe have school debt and everything like that. The idea of, high taxation doesn't really bother you that much because you don't make a lot of money anyway, right? So you're like, sure, tax the rich. I don't care, whatever. Like, I don't have any money. Yeah, we should tax more people but then when you get out of university and then you start working and then you're looking at your paycheck and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, what happened to it? Where did it go? And oh, it's taxes. What? Well, I thought that was on other people. I didn't know it was going to be on me. Interesting. And so again, it's an oversimplification because I'm not here to target the NDP specifically, because I think every political party has certain strengths and certain weaknesses on the flip side. And I've said this to you before, I tend to be much more conservative minded in the sense that I don't like big government because I think big government is, capable of wasting a great deal. At the same time, as a teacher, I believe in, proper funding to institutions that are going to make life better for the average person. So I actually believe in things like good, cheap public transit. I believe in things like, having accessible and affordable, post-secondary education. So I do believe that there is a role for government to play. And at the same time, I don't want to have the government controlling every aspect of my life, because this is where we get into the world of authoritarian governments, right? There's an old saying, any government that's big enough to give you everything you want is also big enough to take it all away. And so that's a very real historical concern as well. It seems like a good idea to sort of hand things over to government, but then all of a sudden, when they start calling the shots and telling you everything you can or can't do, you start to realize, wait a minute, it doesn't really seem like I have much of a say anymore as an individual. And again, there's a lot of nuance to that. I will probably have, especially in this pandemic, when we look at masking and we look at isolation and we look at, healthcare crisis and individual rights, I will definitely be providing one of this sort of reflection articles on some of these more complex issues, about, this idea. And let's get into, the Canadian judicial system here as well, the balance between individual rights and also national security, right? The idea that you as an individual do matter. You as an individual have certain inalienable rights. You have freedom of expression. You have freedom of public assembly, peaceful assembly, excuse me. You have, so many rights that are in the Charter. But we also know that the whole reasonable limits clause is the idea that, yeah, you have rights, but that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. And so actually, if we look at certain aspects of masking, mandates and whatnot, that is kind of an example of what you might say the reasonable limits clause. Because on the one hand, like, well, Mr. Seidenberg, didn't you say that Justin Trudeau said, hey, you can't, he can't force me to wear a party hat on his birthday? Well, I mean, a mask is something that they want us to wear. Does the government have the power to force me as a citizen to mask if I don't want to? And again, this is where we get into the tricky nuance of public safety and individual rights, because it isn't as simple as you might think. And actually, I'm not sure, I might save that for grade 11 law, because that might be overly tricky. I don't know if you've heard recently in the news that they are considering doing somewhat of a, call it a tax, if you will, on the unvaccinated, sort of like a healthcare style tax that basically says, okay, you don't want to be vaccinated, your choice, I suppose, but it's going to cost you. We can get into and that's happening in Quebec right now. They're looking at it. And what's interesting is there is a lot of popular support, but just because the majority likes an idea doesn't always mean that it holds up with the Constitution. Remember, it shouldn't just be about majority rules. So again, the world is incredibly complex. Like I said, I mean, I've been teaching this course for over a decade. And at the same time, there is still a news article or a challenge before the courts that gets my head scratching, each and every day. So really the goal is to continue to grow and to challenge yourself, not to ever think that you've got it all figured out. Because whenever you feel like you've got it all figured out, then that's actually a sort of a spot of pride. And, the Bible says pride goes before destruction. And actually, we see that in history as well, too. Whenever a nation or an empire was like, yeah, we've got this all figured out, we're the best, we're the tops, no one can ever take us. Whenever they let their guard down, that tends to be where you will see, the decline. And so, but anyway, this isn't a history course, this is a civics course. So let us continue. Our judicial system and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I've touched on it briefly. And again, we have videos that recap in a little bit more detail. We know that the judicial branch is not there to make law. They're there to enforce it, right? Judges don't make the law. That would actually be an imbalance of power. If you were a judge that could enforce the law and also make it, that would give you too much power, because that would mean you could be like, a new rule. If I do it, it's not illegal. This goes back to the concept of the rule of law. Okay, the rule of law. And that is the concept of no one is above the law. Politicians, police officers, judges, teachers, firefighters, accountants, celebrities, the list goes on. No one is above the law. Everyone is equal before the law. Now, I also realize you might kind of scratch your head there and be like, yeah, but if you got a lot of wealth and power, isn't it kind of easy for you to like hire a whole bunch of lawyers? And I mean, let's be honest, isn't there kind of a set of rules for rich and famous people and then everybody else? Well, there shouldn't be, right? I realize in practice, there's always going to be this disconnect between the ideals of the rule of law and the reality of the world that we live in. I mean, we do see this apparently happening where, some broke nobody, steals, $20 from a gas station and gets, 10 years in prison. Whereas you look at a Hollywood celebrity that is shoplifting for a thrill, and all of a sudden they're given, rehab or something like that. You might look at that and be like, I don't understand. Why does there seem to be this disconnect? Well, we live in an imperfect world. Okay, so let's start off with that. We live in an imperfect world. There's always going to be inequality that exists to a certain degree. But, and this kind of goes back to the idea of global and active citizenship, we can either kind of give up and say, oh, it's never going to be perfect, so what's the point? Or we can continue to strive to seek out inequality and try to bridge the gap and make things better. Right? We can even go back and we can see where there is great progress. We can go back to, voting rights that I talked about before, right? And the whole idea of, if you were female or a minority, back in 1867, you couldn't vote. I suppose the one attitude could be, well, this system is rigged, forget it. There's no point in me doing anything about it because it's never going to change. There could have been that approach. But there were also courageous people who said, no, I believe in a better world. I believe that we can make things better for everyone. And I'm willing to fight for that, even if people call me names, even if people, threaten me, because I'm doing this for something bigger than myself. And change can happen. I mentioned before that we've already reviewed the bulk of Unit 3 because of, taking up, because of reviewing for the online evaluation and then also taking it up. So again, if we talk about the idea of purposeful, informed, and active citizenship, we've talked about immigration and historic discrimination. We've talked about the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the flip side to that is basically, why is it there? Well, we want to prevent, widespread genocide. We want to build a more equitable world, more sustainable world in the future. And then we also talked about this concept of global citizenship is not something that you get like in your passport, right? It doesn't, you're not a global citizen in the sense where, oh, I can travel anywhere I want because I'm a global citizen and it says so in my passport. That is not a thing. Global citizenship is more of an idea, and it is the idea of looking at yourself not as just an isolated sovereign nation, but looking at other human beings in other countries as part of the human race and saying collectively, I actually talked about this in geography when we look at things like pollution and the earth as a closed system, things that impact people on the other side of the world should be a concern to you here. And that doesn't mean, I've seen the memes, right? Where, people joke about like, oh, I finished all my food because, my parents said that there are starving people in the world. So if I finish the food on my plate, somehow that helps people across, the other world. It doesn't, right? That's a way of your parents kind of guilting you into eating your vegetables. But at the same time, it's a reality check as to how good we actually do have things. And in fact, I have to remind myself of that. I was talking to my wife just the other day about how, you know what? I live in a home where I can adjust the thermostat and, heat comes on and I flick the switch and I have electricity and I can go to the sink and I could get a drink of water. And, just even those things are huge blessings, comparatively speaking, to the vast percentage of the world's population. Again, you might not feel rich. And again, I don't want to turn this into a guilt trip, but one of the things that's going to help you as you prepare for a strong finish to this semester and into semester 2 is going to be the practicing gratitude. Okay. I realize that there's always going to be problems, and I'm not trying to say, okay, just, man up and just, suck it up. Don't worry about it. Like, there are real issues that people have to go with. Some of you may be struggling with illness, either mental, distress, or physical sickness. Those are real things. And at the same time, one of the ways to help cope with the challenges, the real challenges that you do face, is to look for things to be grateful for. And Mr. DeBoer mentioned this in the Zoom chapel earlier this week, the idea of kind of zooming out a little bit, thinking big picture and realizing this is a small part of my life, a small window of time. And I know if you've ever been in isolation because you either had COVID or you had a family member who did and you had to isolate, a 5-day or a 2-week isolation can very much feel like it's never ending. It feels like that in the moment, but at the same time, it's also going to be something that we will look back on this and we'll say, oh man, like I remember at the time I thought things were never going to change. And it's easy to actually be pessimistic considering that, I have videos from, March of 2020 where we were in lockdown and now we're in, our, remote learning again. It's easy to sort of play the deja vu card and be like, oh my goodness, it's never, ever going to get better. It is. And I also want to say this though, if we look back in human history, if we look back at world wars and we look at famine and we look at disease and we look at, there's never been a time in history where things were perfect. There's been, periods of calm, but humankind has always been in this epic struggle, for survival, person against person, person against nature, the idea of fighting the elements, trying to tame it, trying to build up a food surplus, dealing with pandemics and war and disease. None of that is new. And it's actually important to remember that we are susceptible to these things and it said this in the globalization video, actually. One of the dangers of globalization is to sometimes make us feel like we're invincible. And that is a danger, right? Because we're not invincible. We need a reality check every once in a while. And to build a bit of a devotional thought into this, in the book of James, it talks about how, what are humans? We're but a mist that is here for a short time. And that's not designed to be discouraging, but it is designed to put things into perspective, that if we look at an eternal creator God, if we believe in an eternal creative God, then what we're dealing with in our day-to-day lives are no problem, for him, right? If we believe in the sovereignty of God, if we believe that he is capable of all things, then there's actually a certain peace that comes with a laying of your anxieties and your worries before him who is in control of everything. It's hard to do. I don't pretend that it's easy. But that's actually a practice I try to, as a reminder that I am not the creator. I am not in control of a great number of things. So I try, and I forgot to do it today, so maybe this is a helpful reminder for myself, to start the day even with a short prayer that says, God, I'm not in control. Help me to give this day to you. Help me to look to you for strength and guidance. Use me as a part of your plan, whatever that might look like. And may you be glorified, through my life, through the good times and through the bad times. It can be a humbling, but also encouraging way to sort of release some of the tensions that we hold on to that, quite frankly, are outside of our control. It's a hard thing to hear, but yeah, worrying about things that you can't control doesn't make anything better. I love the quote by Corrie ten Boom, who wrote The Hiding Place. She was actually a family that hid Jews during the Holocaust, the genocide of the Second World War. And the quote she shared after going through so many hardships, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote because I'm not reading it directly, I'm just going on memory, but it basically said, worry does nothing to remove tomorrow of its struggle. All it does is remove today of its strength. And I feel like I needed to hear that, right? Worry doesn't take away tomorrow's problems. It just robs you of the strength to deal with the stuff that you need to deal with now. And as we wrap up this recording, I want to leave you with that. I said in the posted statement in regards to wrapping up the semester that this course, really, what is civics about? Civics is about people living together in community, people trying to build a community that works, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. We don't have it all figured out, but we want the world to be a better place. We want to live well with one another. And so trying to contribute in an active way to making our community better than when we found it is one of the best things that we can hope for, right? If we look at this life, I know for myself, and again, in having kids, it has, changed my perspective. I do want to ensure that when the time comes that, hopefully I live a long, full life, but when the time comes for me to no longer be here, I hope that I've been able to have a positive impact on the world, and that I didn't just see it as something where like, oh, what can I get for me? And who can I take advantage of? What can I do, just for my own kind of hedonistic pleasure? How can I positively make a net impact for good? Because if everybody has that attitude, that's what moves us in the direction of making real and positive change. So we're not done the meeting today, because I am going to, pause for questions and comments, but I am going to wrap up the recording sort of on an inspirational note before I keep running my mouth and then ruin everything.